The turkey was dry, the wine over-poured, and the toasts unbearably predictable. Marcus, my older brother, had just closed a 7-figure deal in Denver. Olivia, my younger sister, won an award for her community arts initiative. Even Trina, my sister-in-law, received a round of applause for her new line of gluten-free baby snacks. Everyone had a glass raised in their honor. Everyone, except me. I sat at the far end of the table between the kids and the hallway thermostat, my wine glass untouched, my name not even mentioned. I wasn't surprised anymore. I'd learned long ago that being the steady one, the one who didn't ask for much, who never made a scene, was the surest way to be forgotten. My name is Janet Jackson. I'm 38, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in nonprofit strategy, not the kind that gets televised gala dinners or Instagram campaigns, but the quiet work, the work of helping low-income single mothers find housing, food, safety. It never made headlines. It never got me a toast. 15 years ago, I was director of strategy for a foundation that helped survivors of domestic violence rebuild their lives. That same year, Olivia got her first grant and made it onto a local news segment. My mother framed the article. When I told her we'd just passed legislation that expanded access to emergency housing for abused women in 3 counties, she said, "Oh, that's nice," and went back to folding laundry. That moment stayed with me, not because it hurt the most, but because it confirmed something I'd always suspected. In my family, loud achievements count, quiet impact doesn't. I never married, and I didn't have kids. That made me even harder to categorize. My brother had his boardrooms. Olivia had her advocacy and husband. And I had, what, an apartment with thrift store furniture and a job that drained me but never fed my ego. Still, I stayed. I showed up every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday. I baked pies from scratch, brought gifts, helped set the table. Every year I convinced myself that maybe this time they'd see me, and every year I left more invisible than before. This Thanksgiving was different, though, because this time I wasn't planning to stay. 2 weeks earlier, I'd quietly accepted a part-time role at a youth shelter in Seattle and put in my resignation at the nonprofit. The full-time work had burned me out. The budget cuts, the politics, the unpaid overtime. I wanted to work directly with teens, not on endless PowerPoint decks for donors who never set foot in the shelters they funded. The shelter in Seattle had a garden program and art therapy workshops. The director said she needed someone with a calm presence and quiet leadership. I told her I wasn't sure if I still had any of that left in me. She smiled and said, "I think you do. I think you've just been giving it to the wrong people." So this Thanksgiving, I showed up not to participate but to say goodbye. I had a note in my purse, nothing dramatic, just a few lines I planned to leave behind before I quietly slipped out the door after dessert. I'd already packed most of my apartment. I was scheduled to leave in 4 days. I told no one, because no one had really asked. I arrived exactly on time, 2 p.m., with 2 pies, a bottle of wine, and 0 expectations. My mother opened the door, gave me a once-over, and said, "That jacket's interesting. Is it wool or just synthetic?" I said, "I'm not sure," and stepped inside. The kitchen was full of smells that used to comfort me: sage, garlic, cinnamon, but now just felt heavy. Marcus was already holding court in the living room, telling a story about a client who had tried to out-negotiate him. Olivia's laugh rang out sharp and confident from the dining room. She was arranging place cards. I noticed mine was at the far end. "That's so the kids can reach the cranberry sauce," she explained. "Of course." I poured myself a glass of wine, sat down, and waited for the performances to begin. they didn't disappoint. Toasts were offered, starting with my brother's latest acquisition and ending with my niece's straight A report card. Somewhere in between, Olivia's gallery opening in Chicago got an honorable mention. My name was never said out loud. My mother had forgotten to put a glass at my place. So I raised my water when everyone toasted Rocky, the family dog, for completing obedience school. By the time dessert rolled around, I had decided to leave early. I would drop my note under my plate, grab my coat, and disappear. No one would notice until the next day. Maybe later. It wasn't cruel. It was clarity. I was done trying to earn a place at a table that had already assigned me a seat behind the scenes. I slipped away from the table while laughter still filled the room and walked quietly to the front door. My purse was already on the entryway bench. My hand touched the brass doorknob, cold and solid, and I felt the tension in my shoulders start to release. This was it. No speech, no drama, just an ending. And then, the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps, like something from an old movie. I froze. Another knock followed, more insistent this time. I turned back, unsure whether to ignore it or open it. I heard my father call from the dining room. Janet. Who is it for once? He said my name clearly. I opened the door and stared into the face of an elderly man with kind eyes, holding a manila envelope and an old black and white photograph. Forgive the interruption, he said gently, but I've been looking for you for a very long time. He looked like he'd stepped out of another decade, dressed in a neatly pressed trench coat with silver hair combed back and an umbrella tucked under one arm, despite the dry evening air. The photo in his hand was worn around the edges, yellowed slightly, the kind of image that held secrets from a time before digital memories. The envelope beneath it was sealed with old-fashioned care. He didn't speak right away. He just studied me, as though confirming I was the one he'd been searching for. You're Janet, aren't you? I nodded slowly, my hand still on the doorknob. Behind me, voices from the dining room grew louder, unaware or uninterested in the interruption. I'm sorry to disturb your holiday, he said, but I promised someone I'd deliver this in person, and only to you. I opened the screen door, unsure why. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper I couldn't name. He stepped inside the foyer and glanced around. Is this the Jackson residence? Yes, I said, still unsure whether this was a prank, a mistake, or something else entirely. My name is Anthony Pierce. I knew your grandmother, Elaine. I froze. No one ever talked about Grandma Elaine beyond surface-level things. She died when I was 19, quietly and without much ceremony. No legacy, no letters, just a quick funeral and a few photo albums. My parents called her private, in the way families do when they don't want to explain absence. I was her friend, he said, but more than that. We were partners. She asked me to find you when the time was right. He offered the envelope. I didn't take it at first. My heart beat uncomfortably loud in my ears. She wanted you to have this after you turned 35. It took me a little longer than I planned, but I believe now is the moment she meant. From the hallway, Marcus called out, Janet, what's going on? I turned halfway, hesitating. For once. They noticed I wasn't at the table. You might want to sit for this, Anthony said quietly. His tone was gentle, but not patronizing, for the first time all day. Someone spoke to me like I mattered, like I wasn't an afterthought. I led him into the living room. The family followed like moths to an unfamiliar flame, curious now that something unexpected was unfolding around me. Not them. Mom wiped her hands on a napkin as she entered. What's this about? Her voice was light but sharp. My father stood behind her, silent but wary. This man says he knew Grandma Elaine. Anthony nodded politely. We were colleagues in the 70s and 80s. She went by another name professionally. Most of you likely didn't know that. She was a different kind of woman than she let on. Olivia laughed lightly, a reflex when tension got too thick. Our grandmother. She barely left the house. She made cornbread and watched quiz shows. That's the woman you saw, Anthony replied, unshaken. The woman I knew ran one of the most quietly effective women's advocacy networks in the Pacific Northwest. She wrote under the name Eve Marin. Silence landed like thunder. I didn't blink. That name, I'd read it. Years ago. One of my professors cited her work in a paper on underground feminist journalism. The articles were fierce, deliberate, and careful, anonymous but powerful. It couldn't be the same. Elaine was Eve Marin, I asked, barely trusting my own voice. Anthony smiled softly. Eyes on me now. She was, and she always believed you would carry her torch. He handed me the envelope. She left this for you. I sat down, the envelope heavy in my hand. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Marcus folded his arms. Olivia tilted her head like she was watching theater. And Mom, for once, looked genuinely confused. Why wouldn't she tell us this? Dad asked, his voice tight. Anthony looked at him, not unkindly, because she knew you wouldn't understand. But Janet would. She saw herself in her granddaughter long before you did. I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter written in perfect, sloping cursive and a set of keys bound with a ribbon. At the top, in black ink, it read, "For Janet, when the silence becomes too heavy to bear." My throat tightened. I didn't read it aloud, not yet. I needed time, space. I folded the letter again and tucked it close to me. She wanted me to have this, I said, not to the room, but to myself. Olivia broke the silence. Wait, hold on. Are you saying Grandma left Janet something like a trust or whatever? Not just something, Anthony said calmly. Everything. She left her private archive, her property near Astoria, and a sizable fund under the Marin Foundation. It's all been maintained quietly by a legal team for years. Janet is listed as the successor trustee. Mom sat down hard. Dad blinked slowly, trying to process. Marcus looked suddenly uncomfortable. Why her, he asked. Janet never even, she's barely involved in family matters because she didn't need applause to do good work. Anthony replied simply, because she moved in silence. Just like Elaine, she didn't need attention to prove her worth. Your grandmother saw that in her, and she believed the work could only continue through someone who understood that kind of invisible strength. I stood, not out of drama, but out of instinct. For the first time in decades, I wasn't trying to make myself small to fit. I looked around the room at the family that never really saw me, the people who praised Olivia's ambition, Marcus's success, and Trina's presentation skills. I looked at Anthony, who offered me nothing more than truth. Where is the house, I asked. Near the coast, on 3 acres. It's been maintained. The key opens everything. I nodded. I think I need to go. Mom stood suddenly. Janet, wait, let's talk about this. About what I asked. My voice steady. You don't even know who she was. But we could, Olivia offered, a little too brightly. Maybe we can work together on this. Build something. As a family. The word tasted false. It rang hollow. I tucked the letter into my coat, closed my hand around the key, and met Anthony's gaze. Can we leave tonight? The car's outside. He said, we can be there by morning. I looked around one last time, not in anger, but with a calm I didn't know I had. I wasn't running away. I was answering something bigger than disappointment. I was walking towards something I didn't know I'd been waiting for my entire life. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. as I stepped out into the cold night, I realized for the first time in years, I felt light, not because I was finally seen, but because I had finally chosen to walk where I didn't need to be. The road to Astoria was quiet, a long stretch of empty night lined with pine trees and silence. Anthony didn't speak much, which I appreciated. I sat in the passenger seat, the letter unopened on my lap, the keys resting beside it like small anchors. I could have read the letter during the drive, but I didn't. I wasn't ready yet. I wanted the stillness of her house around me when I did. I wanted to feel her presence in the walls, in the air, in the room she had once lived in alone, while building a legacy none of us had known existed. The idea that my grandmother, quiet and seemingly ordinary, had orchestrated something this intentional, something this exact, made my throat tighten in ways I couldn't explain. For most of my life, I'd been surrounded by people who measured value by volume of income, of followers, of applause. Yet here was a woman who'd done more in silence than any of them had done in spotlight, and she had chosen me. We arrived a little past 1 a.m. The house sat at the edge of the trees, 3 stories tall but modest in shape, its shingled roof and weathered porch suggesting simplicity, not grandeur. The porch light flickered on automatically as we approached. Anthony handed me the key ring and took a step back. "She wanted you to unlock it yourself," he said, and I didn't ask how he knew that. I believed him. I turned the key, and the door creaked open into a space that felt untouched by time. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. The living room was filled with bookshelves and old photographs, none of them staged, none for show. They were snapshots of work, of people, of lives that had brushed up against hers and left something behind. I walked through each room slowly, absorbing the quiet energy. No awards on the wall, no gold plaques, just stacks of handwritten letters, carefully labeled folders, old typewriters, and binders filled with newspaper clippings. Her world had been real and raw and deeply private. She had hidden an entire life inside this home, and no one, not my mother, not my aunts, not her neighbors had known. I ran my fingers across a photo on the hallway table. In it, a group of women stood behind a protest banner. One of them had my eyes. My hands trembled. I wasn't sure if it was grief or recognition. Anthony showed me to a guest room and told me to rest, but sleep didn't come. I sat in the small reading nook by the upstairs window. The letter finally unfolded in my lap. Her handwriting was clear, strong, and utterly unpretentious. "Dear Janet, if you're reading this, it means the silence I've carried for most of my life is finally ready to break." I swallowed hard. I kept reading. I never told my children who I was outside of being their mother. They wouldn't have understood, or worse, they would have tried to make it small. But you always had a way of moving quietly through rooms and leaving them better than when you entered. I recognized that. I saw myself in that. I know what it means to do meaningful work without applause, and I know how lonely that can be when no one sees it. I blinked away something sharp behind my eyes. She was writing from a place no one else had ever spoken to me from. I spent decades running an underground publication, funding community programs, and advocating for women who had nowhere else to turn. But I did it in the shadows, because I knew that sometimes the loudest voices draw the most danger. I wrote under the name Eve Marin because it gave me freedom. And now, I want you to have that freedom too, not to hide, but to choose how you want to be seen. I let the word settle. She wasn't handing me an inheritance. She was offering me permission, the house, the archive, and the foundation. All of it is yours to manage, ignore, or transform. But know this, you were never invisible to me. You were exactly the person I hoped would carry this forward when the time was right. You don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't need to prove your worth to people who forgot to notice it for 38 years. Your life is yours now. There was a silence between the last sentence and the signature that felt intentional, not empty, but full of breath. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest. It didn't erase the years of erasure. It didn't magically fill the voids left by a family that never made space for me. But it did something deeper. It reminded me that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy, that sometimes the people who matter most don't speak loudly, but they see everything. In the days that followed, I stayed in the house. I didn't return calls or respond to texts. Olivia messaged me 3 times, asking if we could talk about Grandma's decision. Marcus sent a vague voice memo saying he didn't know she had all this stuff going on and maybe we could figure something out together. I ignored them, not out of bitterness, but because I had nothing to give them. They'd spent years acting like I was furniture, convenient when needed, invisible otherwise. Now that I was holding something they couldn't control, their interest felt shallow. Anthony helped me begin cataloging the foundation's documents. We found grants that had been sent anonymously to shelters I'd worked with. She'd been supporting the work I was doing long before I knew it. We uncovered articles she'd written that still felt urgent today on poverty, abuse, gender discrimination. Her words weren't historical. They were fuel. I wasn't just stepping into her legacy. I was building the next chapter. One afternoon, while sorting through a locked file cabinet, I found a folder labeled, "For the Woman Who Waits Too Long to Be Heard." Inside were photos of me, at high school graduation, at a rally I'd organized in college, a clipping from a local paper where I'd been quoted about community safety. She had been watching, she had been listening, when no one else did. It occurred to me that perhaps my grandmother never needed the world's applause because she had always made sure someone else got to shine. Maybe her power wasn't in what she did, but in how she prepared others to do more. Maybe the most radical thing she ever did was believe in me quietly until I was ready to believe in myself. The decision wasn't hard. I wouldn't be returning to Portland. I wouldn't sit at another Thanksgiving table where silence swallowed me whole. This house, this mission, this voice, I was going to make it mine. The first time I opened the filing cabinet in the study, the lock resisted me, like it had been waiting for someone to approach it with intention, not curiosity. It clicked open on the 3rd try, and what lay inside didn't feel like paperwork. It felt like architecture, pages and files and photographs stacked with such meticulous order that I could see her hands moving through them even though she was gone. The folders weren't labeled for convenience. They were labeled for legacy. There were sections for press clippings, grant reports, field letters from shelters and clinics across Oregon, even journals from anonymous writers whose identities were likely buried forever for safety. I spent an entire day just reading letters. Some were heartbreaking. Some were too raw to finish in one sitting. All of them were addressed to Eve Marin, her pseudonym, her shield, her sword. These weren't letters written to a public figure. They were written to someone who'd shown up when no one else did. One woman described fleeing her home in the middle of the night, only to find a box of food, cash, and a burner phone on her doorstep a week later. Another woman had been smuggled across state lines by a network of volunteers funded quietly by a grant from an unknown donor. I began to see the truth that had lived behind my grandmother's silence. It wasn't shame that kept her quiet. It was discipline. She had chosen impact over credit, presence over praise, and now she had chosen me. That realization didn't land with joy. It landed with pressure, because I wasn't her. I wasn't built with the same fire, or at least I didn't think I was. She had carried an entire hidden operation on her back while raising children and tending a home and making sure no one suspected a thing. I had trouble getting through emails without doubting myself. What was I supposed to do with all this? How could I take on a foundation rooted in sacrifice and danger when I had just left my job because of burnout? That night, I sat in the sunroom with the box of letters on my lap and my phone buzzing across the table. It was Olivia, again, the third message in 2 days. Janet, I just think it's really unfair that no one else even knew about this. Grandma clearly had resources, and you just get to decide what happens now. Can we talk? I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to reframe. She wanted to cast this as a misunderstanding instead of what it truly was, a long overdue course correction. But I didn't reply. I didn't owe her closure for a door she never cared to open in the first place. 2 days later, Anthony returned with legal documents. We sat at the long oak table in the kitchen while he slid the folders toward me, explaining the structure of the foundation, its holdings, its board, its history. I listened carefully, asking only the questions I needed to ask. When we were done, he looked at me and said, Elaine wanted to know if you'd continue the work, but she never pressured you. The board has an interim director in place. You can walk away if you want to. I stared at the signature line in front of me. If I signed, I'd be stepping into a role bigger than any I'd ever held. If I didn't, I'd be walking away from the one person who had truly seen me for who I was. I don't need the whole legacy to rest on me, I said finally, but I do need to make sure it doesn't disappear. I'll take it. My voice didn't shake. I signed my name and felt something settle in my chest. Like a breath I'd been holding for years had finally been released. Over the next few weeks, I moved into the house fully. I unpacked what little I'd brought from Portland. My old apartment had been sparse anyway, a place I kept clean and impersonal because I never thought I'd be there long. The house in Astoria became something else entirely. Not a retreat, not an escape, but a base, a command center. I reactivated the foundation's programs, called meetings with the board, and introduced updated strategies for outreach based on my experience working with underserved youth. They listened, not because I spoke louder, but because I spoke from the inside out. I knew the texture of silent work. I knew what it meant to be dismissed, to be overlooked in meetings, cut off mid-sentence, credited in footnotes instead of headlines. That knowledge wasn't baggage. It was my advantage. 3 weeks after signing, I flew to Boise to meet with a shelter the foundation had supported for 10 years. They didn't know I was coming. I didn't want a ceremony. I just wanted to walk the halls, talk to the staff, hear what was working and what wasn't. When the director realized who I was, she froze, then hugged me like someone who finally found the right person to thank. Your grandmother saved this place twice. She said, no one knew, but when funding dried up, a check arrived from a new LLC with no return address. That was her. Right. I nodded. It's going to keep coming, I said. But this time, the return address will be real. On the flight back, I stared out the window and thought about the people I used to work for, the executives who held donor meetings in glass conference rooms while I begged them to read impact reports. They hadn't seen me, but that no longer mattered. I was done asking to be seen. I was busy doing the work. The text from Marcus arrived as I was landing. Just heard about everything. Wow. Really happy for you. Let me know if you ever want to talk through scaling strategy. I've done a lot of work with startups. Could be useful. I didn't reply. I didn't feel cruel about it. Just clear. For years. They had watched me give, and they had responded with silence. Now they wanted to be included because inclusion meant access, but they didn't want to understand. They didn't want to unlearn the habits that made it easy to ignore someone like me. And I wasn't here to educate them anymore. I wasn't angry. I just wasn't available. That clarity came without fanfare. No swelling music, no grand monologue, just a quiet recognition that I no longer needed their praise to feel solid. I had work to do. I had letters to read, grants to approve, lives to impact, and for the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom to do it on my terms, in my own voice, in a house built by someone who knew exactly what it meant to be powerful without having to shout. It didn't take long for the family to shift from silent shock to strategic inquiry. 1 week after I took official control of the Marin Foundation, I received an email from Olivia titled Some Thoughts. It was 2 paragraphs of praise wrapped tightly around a single point. She wanted to collaborate on a campaign that could spotlight the foundation's legacy and elevate the family story. I knew what that meant. She wanted to co-opt the narrative, reposition herself in the light now that the light had moved. I didn't respond, not out of resentment, but because there was nothing to say. I wasn't interested in turning this into a brand. It wasn't a comeback tour. It was the continuation of something sacred. 2 days later, Marcus called. I've been thinking we should really be aligning this foundation with some high-profile partnerships. I have a few friends in tech philanthropy circles. If we position it right, you could raise double the operating budget in 6 months. I let him talk for 3 minutes before quietly interrupting. We're not scaling. We're deepening. That's the priority. He paused. Janet, this isn't personal. This is about reach. I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. For you, maybe, but for me, this is about integrity. And I'm not interested in using grandma's work to validate people who only showed up now that there's something visible on the table. The silence that followed was satisfying in a way that applause never could be. It wasn't revenge. It was resolution, for the first time. I had drawn a line and held it, not with anger, not with bitterness, just with clarity. That kind of boundary has a way of reshaping the entire room. They didn't know what to do with it. They were used to me accommodating, adjusting, disappearing. But now, I wasn't going back to who I was before. I was growing into who I had always been. The work began in earnest. I hired 2 women who had both aged out of the foster care system and had gone on to get degrees in social work. They knew what it meant to be overlooked. They didn't need a training manual on empathy. They lived it. We restructured the grant application process to remove barriers that favored polished applicants and penalized the real ones. I wrote a series of articles under my own name about building trauma-informed programs from the ground up. One of them got picked up by a national nonprofit newsletter that week. My phone lit up with messages from old colleagues and college friends I hadn't heard from in years. They said they were so proud and not surprised. I appreciated the sentiment, but I didn't reply to most, because the truth was, they hadn't noticed me before, and I wasn't going to pretend that their silence didn't matter. It had shaped me. It had carved out parts of me I was still learning to rebuild. 3 months into the role, the board organized a retreat at the lake house, not the one from my grandmother's time, but a newer space donated by a quiet benefactor who'd once been helped anonymously through the foundation. That was the thing about doing the work in silence. It echoes in places you'll never see. The board members were all older than me, all professionals with long histories in education, mental health, and policy. But when I presented the new roadmap for the next 2 years, they didn't interrupt. They listened. They asked questions, but not to poke holes, to understand. At the end of my presentation, the chairwoman stood and said, "You speak like someone who's had to fight to be heard for a long time. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need." It was the kind of affirmation I'd spent years chasing from my family. And it landed more softly than I expected. Not because it didn't matter, but because it wasn't what I needed anymore. I'd stopped measuring my worth by the volume of other people's approval. I was living in alignment now. That was more powerful than any toast could ever be. But just as the work deepened, the family reaction escalated. At Easter, Olivia published an op-ed about quiet matriarchs and legacy, conveniently omitting my name but lifting entire phrases from my press materials. Trina posted a carousel of family photos, ending with a photo of Grandma Elaine captioned, "A woman ahead of her time. We carry your torch." I stared at that photo for 10 minutes. Trina had never even asked me about Elaine's work. She just knew the image now had currency. I didn't comment. I didn't engage. Instead, I scheduled a donor update session and brought in 3 women from the shelter in Boise to speak about how the foundation had changed their lives. No press, no filters, just real stories, told in their own words. One of the women, barely 22, had survived trafficking, homelessness, and addiction. She stood in the room with her head high and her voice steady and said, "I didn't know people like me were allowed to have futures, but someone gave me one, and now I'm giving it to someone else." When she finished, there was silence, not the awkward kind, the holy kind, the kind that follows truth. That night, I stood by the lake and read my grandmother's second letter. It had been sealed in a different envelope, marked only with the words, "For when it starts to feel heavy inside." She wrote, "There will be people who show up late and try to make your story theirs. Let them. Your truth doesn't need defending. Your work will speak louder than they ever can, and the people who need it most will know where it came from. Keep going." It didn't feel like a message from the past. It felt like a lifeline pulled from the present. I folded the letter and returned it to the drawer in my room, right next to a photo of her holding a clipboard, surrounded by women with tired eyes and quiet strength. That night, I didn't dream of being seen. I dreamed of doing more. By the end of summer, the foundation had launched 2 new programs, one for incarcerated mothers preparing for re-entry, and another for high school girls at risk of dropping out due to family instability. We partnered with mental health counselors, job placement experts, and community mentors. The results weren't flashy. There were no press releases, but the changes were real. One girl went from sleeping in her car to starting nursing school. Another got her GED and applied for a housing grant. Every time we handed someone a key to a better future. I thought of that night I had stood at the front door in Portland, ready to walk away without saying goodbye. If I hadn't opened the door, none of this would have happened. The thought chilled me, not in fear, but in reverence. Sometimes the door you think is your exit turns out to be your beginning. By autumn, the work had consumed me in the best way. My days began early and ended late, not out of obligation, but because purpose has a way of dissolving fatigue. The foundation was no longer just surviving. It was adapting, reaching further, pushing deeper into the cracks the world had long ignored. We weren't building a brand. We were repairing a system from the inside out. I hosted closed-door strategy sessions with other women-led nonprofits, sharing everything from grant writing templates to staff wellness plans. I knew what burnout felt like. I knew what it meant to keep giving from an empty cup. And I wanted these women to have tools I never did. We weren't networking. We were aligning. Every time we created something useful, we shared it. No watermarks, no trade secrets, just generosity disguised as strategy. Still, back in Portland, the narrative continued without me, or rather, around me. Olivia posted a podcast episode titled, "What Legacy Really Means." I didn't listen, but someone sent me a clip. She spoke about women in the family who sacrificed behind the scenes and how we're all beneficiaries of a quiet kind of power. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so familiar. Trina posted a blog about modern matriarchs and used one of Grandma Elaine's quotes without attribution. Marcus announced a partnership with a corporate foundation, implying that it was inspired by a family model of giving. They had no shame, but I wasn't surprised anymore. This was how people who'd never felt overlooked acted when someone else became impossible to ignore. They didn't ask questions. They reframed the story to fit themselves. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't correct them. Instead, I sent 2 new program directors to a national conference in Chicago and gave them the platform to speak about the work. Both had grown up in unstable homes. Both had overcome systems that tried to erase them. They took the stage in a room full of policymakers and donors and told the truth, not the polished kind, but the kind that sticks in your throat. And when the session ended, people didn't applaud immediately. They sat in silence first. That silence meant more than 1,000 likes. It meant the room had been rearranged. Then came the email from my mother. It was short, only 3 sentences. I saw the article about the conference. I didn't know the work had grown this much. Your grandmother would be proud. No questions, no apology. But it was the first unprompted acknowledgement I'd received from her since I was 19. I stared at it for 5 minutes, unsure what to feel. Gratitude, resentment. Maybe both, maybe neither. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because the conversation she wanted now was decades late. You can't pour connection over years of neglect and expect it to bloom. You have to start from scratch, and I didn't have space for that yet. The work was too important, but not everyone stayed silent. One afternoon, I got a voicemail from Dad. His voice sounded different, slower, like he'd been rehearsing. "Hey, I know we didn't always see what you were doing. I'm not proud of that, but I'm proud of you now. I read some of Elaine's old articles. I understand more than I did before. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." I didn't call back immediately. I let it sit. But 2 weeks later, I sent him a photo of our newest project, a transitional housing center for teenage girls aging out of foster care. It had been Elaine's dream, tucked into one of her journals. I'd found her sketch of the building, her handwritten budget, even the name she wanted it to carry, the Marin House. I had honored every detail. Dad replied an hour later. She would have cried to see this. I stared at that sentence for longer than I'd admit, not because of what he said, but because for once, he wasn't speaking about Wesley or Olivia or himself. He was speaking about her, about me, about something real. By November, the first residents of Marin House had moved in. I spent Thanksgiving morning cooking with them. No fancy table settings, no toasts, no hierarchy, just young women learning how to be safe in their own skin again. One of them, 17 and newly sober, handed me a small card she'd drawn by hand. On it, she'd written, "Thank you for seeing me." No one ever really did before. I hugged her, and in that moment, I realized the quietest victories are often the most honest. No camera, no headline, just 2 people standing in the same light. That night, alone in the sunroom, I opened the final envelope Elaine had left for me. It was labeled simply, "When you're ready to host." Inside was a list of dishes, a table layout, and her version of a Thanksgiving guest list filled with names I'd never met. Most of them women she had helped quietly over the years. At the bottom, in her sharp cursive, was a note: "Build your own table. Invite only those who bring peace. The rest will find their way, or they won't. But your life is not their invitation." I read it twice. Then I stood up, opened my laptop, and drafted an email invitation, not to the family in Portland, but to the women running shelters in Idaho, the counselors who volunteered at the Youth Drop-In Center, the program alumni who now worked as advocates themselves. The subject line was simple: a different kind of Thanksgiving. And when the day came, we gathered around the old oak table at the house in Astoria. There were no rehearsed speeches, no toasts ranked by status, just stories, laughter, and enough warmth to undo years of cold. As I looked around the room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, seen, alive in a way I hadn't been in decades, not because I'd finally proven myself, but because I'd stopped trying to. Because when you build the right kind of table, you never have to beg for a seat again. Exactly 1 year after I had stood alone at the door in Portland with my resignation letter in my bag and goodbye unspoken on my lips, I found myself standing at a different threshold this time, not as someone forgotten, but as someone hosting. It was Thanksgiving again, and this year, for the first time in my life, I was the one who sent out the invitations. But it wasn't for revenge. I didn't plan to show off or stage a comeback. I invited my family not to prove anything, but because I was no longer afraid of being ignored. I had already walked through the worst of that silence and come out the other side, knowing exactly who I was. They arrived one by one, uncertain at first. My mother was the last to step through the door, her coat buttoned too tightly, eyes scanning the space like it might collapse under truth. She said, "You've done a lot with the place." And I nodded, not filling the quiet that followed. Marcus brought wine. Olivia brought a bouquet wrapped in paper that matched her curated outfit. Trina, of course, had a camera ready and asked immediately, "Do you mind if we get a few family photos while the lighting is good?" I gave her the same answer I'd given to dozens of donors and reporters in the past year. "We're not here to perform. We're here to be present. If that makes for a good photo, feel free." The dining table was full of food, of people, of tension that tried to hide under small talk. But I didn't shrink this time. I didn't reach for invisibility like armor. I hosted the way Elaine would have, with calm precision, with stories that centered people who never made it into headlines. My guests this year included 3 women from Marin House who had no other place to go, and 2 program directors who'd become like family through fire. They weren't tokens. They were part of the foundation now, literal and symbolic. They sat at the same table, shared the same bread, added new voices to a family that had once felt like a closed system. Dinner passed in waves. My father kept his eyes mostly on his plate. Olivia dominated most conversations, as usual, until one of the Marin House residents asked her, "So what kind of work do you actually do?" It wasn't meant with judgment, just curiosity. But Olivia paused, caught for the first time without a script. "I do storytelling projects," she said, glancing at me, mostly about underrepresented voices. The silence that followed could have been sharp, but the resident nodded and said, "Cool. You should come by the house sometime. We're starting a spoken word night." And that was that. No one needed to spell out the irony. It just sat between us like an invisible thread, waiting to be acknowledged. After dessert, as everyone lingered over coffee and pie, my father stood unexpectedly and asked if he could say a few words. I didn't know what was coming, but I let him speak. "I used to think the measure of success was visibility," he said, voice quiet but steady. "Titles, awards, articles. I thought we were proud of people for what they showed the world. But this year has taught me a lot, and most of what I've learned came from watching Janet. Every head turned toward me, and for a split second, the old instinct to deflect rose up in my throat, but I stayed still. I let the moment land. Your grandmother saw you when we didn't," he continued. "That shames me more than I can explain. But today, I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to say thank you for carrying something bigger than legacy, for building something real." No applause followed, just the kind of quiet that feels earned, the kind of quiet that holds weight. I looked at him, not with pity or triumph, but with something close to peace. "Thanks, Dad," I said simply. I didn't need more. I didn't need a dramatic arc. Sometimes the smallest acknowledgments hit the deepest scars. After they left, Olivia lingered by the door. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't try to reframe the year. She just looked at me and said, "I didn't know you were this strong." I raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "I was always this strong. You just weren't looking." She nodded, for once without a comeback, and then she left. Later that night, I walked down to the dock where Elaine used to sit and write. The stars above were sharp and cold, and the lake was still enough to see the reflection of every light from the house. Behind me, the new life I had built glowed without effort, not loud, not flashy, but undeniable. A year ago, I had nearly walked away from my own story, and if that stranger hadn't knocked, I might have. But life has a strange way of honoring quiet strength, even if it takes time, even if it takes loss, even if the people closest to you are the last to notice. I pulled the final envelope from my coat pocket, the one I hadn't opened yet. It had no label, no instruction, just my name, written in the handwriting of a woman who never needed to shout to be heard. Inside was a single piece of paper, no message, just a photo. It was a black and white image of Elaine, sitting at this very dock, holding a notebook in her lap, her eyes looking somewhere just past the lens. On the back, in tiny letters, she had written, "You'll know when it's yours." I folded the photo and slid it into my journal, not because I needed proof, but because I understood what she meant now. The house, the foundation, the silence, the stories. They weren't just mine to inherit. They were mine to protect, to evolve, to pass on. And I would, but not by becoming louder, by becoming clearer. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction, but creation. The months that followed Thanksgiving were a strange blend of quiet victories and subtle reckonings, without fanfare. The foundation crossed its highest impact metrics since Elaine had first started it. Our re-entry program for women leaving incarceration had helped 54 mothers reunite with their children. Marin House expanded into a second location, this time closer to the city, funded not through flashy galas or celebrity endorsements, but through small, consistent donors who had once been helped themselves. Our Trauma-Informed Schools initiative landed a quiet feature in a national education journal. And for the first time in my life, my name was listed not as an assistant, not as Janet from development, but as lead architect of the program. No one in my family commented, but I no longer needed their applause to feel legitimate. The work had its own rhythm now, its own proof. Still, not everything stayed silent. In March, Olivia published a book. It was titled Invisible Women Legacy, Labor, and the Ones We Forgot to Thank. Her name was in large, gold-stamped letters across the cover, the content, though branded as a collection of essays, read like a repackaging of the legacy she never owned but wanted to claim. There was an entire chapter on our grandmother, Elaine, in which Olivia waxed poetic about a woman she'd barely spoken to, lifting entire lines from the Foundation's archival releases, my words, my team's work, twisted into metaphors, not credited, just absorbed. I got the advance copy from a colleague who had been excited to see a familiar story make it into print. She didn't realize I hadn't given permission. I sat in the sunroom with the book in my lap, flipping through pages that felt like someone trying to wear a coat that didn't fit, then acting surprised when it didn't keep them warm. For a moment, I considered calling her, confronting, demanding correction, but I didn't. Instead, I wrote a quiet piece of my own, a short essay titled The Cost of Silence, reflecting on how legacy is often misremembered when people only show up after the applause begins. It wasn't aimed at anyone by name. It was a mirror, not a weapon. I published it in the Foundation's quarterly report. It circulated more than I expected, and eventually found its way back to her. She never responded directly, but I noticed her tone shift in interviews after that, less certainty, more space. She stopped mentioning the Foundation, stopped referencing the legacy like it was hers to mold. Maybe she understood, maybe she didn't. But the echo of truth has a way of softening even the loudest rebranding. Around the same time, I got an invitation to speak at a university symposium on restorative leadership. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who felt at home behind a podium. My work had always been in the hallway, in the meeting that happens after the meeting, in the one-on-one sessions where the real work gets done. But something about the invitation felt different, maybe because this time, it didn't come from someone trying to leverage my name. It came from a student I had mentored years ago, someone who had once said, "You made me feel real for the first time." So I accepted. On the day of the event, I stood backstage in a simple black dress, no stylist, no entourage, just me and my notes. I looked out at the room, a mixture of students, educators, nonprofit leaders, and felt a calm settle over me that had taken a lifetime to earn. When I stepped up to the mic, I didn't tell them a heroic story. I told them a true one, about being invisible, about being passed over, about how some victories don't come with clapping, but with a door quietly opening that no one else noticed. I spoke about Elaine, about how legacy isn't about being remembered by everyone. It's about being remembered by someone, and how the most powerful work often comes from people who've spent their lives sitting at the edge of the room, watching, listening, waiting for a chance to do things differently. When I finished, there was a pause, then a standing ovation. But the part that stayed with me wasn't the applause. It was the line of students that formed afterward, most of them women, many of them first-generation college attendees, all of them holding notebooks filled with underlined sentences. One girl, maybe 19, handed me a letter. I didn't know people like me were allowed to lead. She said, I opened it later. In the car, it was filled with her story, foster care, survival, doubt, and ended with, "You reminded me that quiet doesn't mean powerless. It just means patient." I pinned it to my office wall the next morning. That spring, the Foundation launched its first Writer-in-Residence program, designed for women who'd experienced systemic erasure through incarceration, poverty, or just silence. We gave them stipends, safe housing, and one thing the world never gave them without conditions: time to write, to heal, to speak. One of them, an older woman who had spent 2 decades in prison, read a piece aloud at our first internal showcase. It was about motherhood, grief, and the way prison rewires your voice until you forget how to use it. When she finished, there was no applause, just tears. And then, one by one, people stood up not to perform appreciation, but because some stories demand you rise for them. It was in that moment I finally understood what Elaine had seen in me. Not potential, not talent, but capacity. The ability to hold space for people to find their voice without needing to be the loudest one in the room myself. I had spent years thinking I had to earn my place, but all along, it was never about a place at someone else's table. It was about building tables where people like me never had to ask for permission again. Later that evening, as the house settled into quiet again, I stood in Elaine's old study and opened the drawer where I kept her journals. I didn't read them this time. I just placed a small photo inside. It was one from the symposium, me standing with the students. None of us looking posed, all of us mid-laugh. I didn't label it. I didn't date it. I just slid it between her notes, as if to say, we're still going. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it builds quietly. Sometimes it heals. Sometimes it outlasts the noise. By summer, the foundation had entered a season of quiet acceleration. We weren't going viral. We weren't trending. But in rooms that actually mattered in courtrooms, shelters, training rooms, classrooms, we were present, impactful, consistent. The work had matured into its own ecosystem, built not on spectacle, but on the trust of people who had once been invisible and now led programs, created resources, mentored others, for every name that was never mentioned in press releases. We built systems of support that didn't rely on validation. And that, more than anything else, was the revenge, not against any single person, but against the world's assumption that quiet equals weak. I thought I had grown numb to the way my family maneuvered around credit, but that illusion dissolved when a local magazine reached out, asking to do a feature on the Jackson legacy, focusing on 3 generations of civic-minded women. I declined immediately. I could already picture the spread, photos of Olivia in curated lighting, quotes pulled from Trina's blog, some version of my grandmother distilled into bullet points and hashtags, scrubbed of the inconvenient parts. I wrote the editor back and said plainly, we're not interested in myth-making. We're interested in justice. The email made its way back to Olivia. I knew because 2 days later, she left me a voicemail. I wasn't trying to steal anything. She said, I just thought, maybe it was time we all got to be part of it. It was a fascinating sentence. We all got to be part of it. As if legacy was a party you show up to once the hard work is done. As if you get to skip the years of being ignored, dismissed, overwritten, and then casually insert yourself when the room gets warmer. I didn't call her back, not out of anger, but because I had learned something far more valuable than confrontation, that sometimes silence isn't passive, it's precision. It's the refusal to let your energy be extracted one more time for someone else's narrative. But not every call that summer came with strings. One Thursday morning, as I walked the grounds of our newest community garden project, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was an older woman named Lorraine, who introduced herself as one of Elaine's former collaborators from the early days. She had heard that the foundation was active again and wanted to meet. We arranged lunch at a small diner an hour from the coast. She walked in wearing a worn leather jacket, eyes sharp, voice low. I wasn't sure you'd show, she said, sliding into the booth. Most people running things these days like to Zoom everything. I don't run it, I said, stirring my tea. I just listen and try not to mess up what she built. She smiled, a tired kind of smile. You sound like her. Over sandwiches and black coffee. Lorraine told me stories I'd never heard, not about programs or board meetings, but about fear, about the time Elaine's car was vandalized after she helped expose a housing scam targeting single mothers, about the day they had to shut down a shelter overnight because of a threat, about how Elaine never once backed down, but also never once played the hero. She believed that the most important thing you could do was hold the door open and keep your name off the banner, said it protected the mission from ego. She never told any of this to us, I said quietly. She didn't trust most of your family to understand, Lorraine replied, without bitterness, and she was right. But she did trust you, even before you knew who you were. I didn't respond. I just sat there, letting that sink in, because no one had ever said it like that before, that she trusted me, not because I had the answers, but because I moved the same way she did quietly, but with direction. Before we parted ways, Lorraine handed me a small envelope. Inside was a copy of an unpublished essay Elaine had written late in her life, titled Permission Not Required. It was a reflection on how women are taught to ask for space, for voice, for legitimacy. But some legacies are built precisely because the builders stop waiting for those things. The essay ended with a single line, if they never open the door. Become the wall that makes one. That line stayed with me for days. The next week, we held a strategy retreat for all program directors and alumni fellows instead of a formal keynote. I opened the weekend by reading that essay aloud. I didn't frame it. I didn't explain. I just let Elaine speak. And when I finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. One by one, people began sharing what door they had built. A woman who had survived trafficking spoke about returning to the same city where she was once arrested, now working as a youth counselor. A former foster youth described founding a mentorship network for LGBTQ teens rejected by their families. A staff member who rarely spoke in meetings said, I didn't think I mattered until someone let me lead something small. Now I want to make sure no one else waits for permission again. That night, sitting alone on the steps outside the lodge, I finally allowed myself a moment I hadn't let myself feel in years. Pride, not the loud kind, not the pride that needs to be posted, quoted, or performed, but the kind that settles deep in your bones, the kind that says, you didn't just survive the silence, you transformed it. Back in Portland, the whispers quieted. My family still performed their versions of community, legacy, leadership, but they no longer attempted to center themselves in mine. Maybe they realized the foundation was not a stage. Maybe they finally respected the fact that just because something shares your blood doesn't mean it owes you its name. And when I passed the bookshelf one morning and saw Olivia's book tucked between a national bestseller and an old journal of Elaine's, I didn't remove it. I just moved it to the bottom shelf, not to diminish it, but to place it where it belonged. Part of the story, but not the center, because the center now held something else entirely, something built without permission, sustained without spotlight, and powerful enough to stand, even when no one claps. It's a strange thing, coming full circle without needing closure. You think you'll want a final reckoning, a last word, some grand moment where everyone who doubted you admits they were wrong. But when the work becomes your world, and the people you lift begin to rise on their own, that craving dissolves, not because you've forgotten what they did, but because your life no longer revolves around the proof. It revolves around impact, and that's the difference between revenge and repair. One tries to show them, the other no longer needs to. 1 year after our second Marin House opened its doors, we hosted our first alumni summit. 40 women flew in from across the country, each one a living chapter in a story that had been almost erased. Some brought their children, some came alone. All of them came with something to say. It wasn't a formal event. No photographers, no press, just a weekend of shared meals, strategy sessions, and open mic nights filled with laughter and brutal honesty. I stood at the back of the main room most of the time, listening, watching, letting the ones who had once been voiceless carry the narrative now. That, to me, was the greatest form of justice. Midway through the summit, a woman named Deja, one of our earliest residents, approached me, holding a manila envelope. "You probably don't remember," she said, "but you gave me a notebook when I first arrived, told me not to write anything perfect, just to get it out. I kept it, and I kept writing." She handed me the envelope, smiled, and walked away before I could respond. Inside were 70 pages of her story, raw, sharp, beautiful. At the top of the first page, she had written, "You made space for my voice. Here it is." I sat in my office that night and read every word. Later, I walked out to the porch of the main house, sat on the swing Elaine once favored, and stared up at the stars, the same ones that had watched me pack my bags in silence, the same ones that had watched them praise everyone but me. The difference now was, I no longer needed the stars to witness. I had people, real people, and that mattered more. I thought about writing a memoir, not out of vanity, but as a roadmap for others who had been erased, dismissed, repackaged by people with louder voices and softer stakes. But then I remembered what Elaine wrote in that final essay: legacy doesn't require your name in lights. It requires your name in truth. And I decided that maybe the best legacy I could leave wouldn't be bound in pages or printed in hardcover. Maybe it would be passed on through practices, through principles, through people who had once sat in silence and now ran rooms. Still, I couldn't help but think of Portland. So I went back, not for a holiday, not for a headline, just for me. I walked the streets I once ran down as a teenager, past the bookstore where I used to write my college papers when home felt too crowded, walked by the church where Grandma Elaine had hosted her first women's shelter fundraiser. It was still there, still modest, still standing. I didn't go in, just placed a folded note under the side door. Nothing dramatic. Just 5 words. She was never invisible. Love, Janet. I visited the family house, too, stood across the street, not as a daughter waiting for acceptance, but as a woman who had found wholeness elsewhere. Olivia had moved out. Trina was abroad. Dad was older now, slower. When he stepped outside to get the mail, I waved. He looked surprised, but smiled. "Visiting?" he asked. "No," I said, "just passing through." He nodded, like he understood what that really meant. We stood in silence for a few moments before he said, "The foundation's doing amazing work." I just nodded. "You'd be proud of the team," I added, then turned to go. He didn't stop me, just said, "Elaine would be proud of you." I didn't turn around, just raised a hand in acknowledgement and walked away. Because some stories don't end with reconciliation, they end with resolve. In the fall, we launched the Second Voice Fellowship, a program for women across the country building community spaces that center healing and visibility. It wasn't named after me. It wasn't even promoted under the foundation's main site. It was its own entity, built to outlast us all. One of the first fellows was Deja. Another was a young woman who had once emailed me late at night saying, "I don't know where to begin, but I know I don't want to disappear." She never did. She wrote policy now, real, permanent change. And that's the thing. The people who once silenced you may never apologize. They may never call what they did betrayal, but they will feel your absence. They will notice your distance. They will hear your name in rooms they once thought belonged only to them. And it won't be because you shouted louder. It'll be because you built something they can't unsee. On the anniversary of Elaine's passing, we held a private candlelight gathering at the original Marin House. No speeches, no programs, just everyone she helped or inspired reading something they'd written, or sitting quietly in her memory. I read nothing that night. I just sat in her chair, surrounded by women who carried her voice forward in ways she never could have predicted. That was the loudest thing I'd ever said, without speaking a word. And as I walked home under a sky just beginning to snow, I thought of that moment, Thanksgiving, all those years ago, the table, the toasts, the absence, and the knock. I smiled, because the door that once opened to rejection had become the one through which everything else had walked in.